Currently today, 700 million people live in extreme poverty. This means they don't have access to simple things that we take for granted, such as shelter, food, water, energy, somewhere safe to live. And humanitarian engineering is trying to help these people. It's using engineering and the tools and skills we provide as engineers to benefit the lives and livelihoods of those most in need. There's been a big change in how we try and help low and middle income countries achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and improve the lives and livelihoods of the people living there. Humanitarian engineering is about working with those people in need, understanding what their priorities are, understanding what the knowledge and the existing information is, and then working with them to develop a solution that's both sustainable and appropriate. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Humanitarian Engineering Empowering Lives. I would like to start tonight's event by acknowledging the Bedegal people that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respect to the elders both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. My name is Andrew Dansie, and I am the academic lead of Humanitarian Engineering at UNSW. I am tremendously proud to hold this position, and while my title is currently the only one to formally have the word humanitarian in it, this is in no way a reflection of the immense footprint that UNSW Engineering has in the humanitarian and international development space. Colleagues across all schools of engineering here at UNSW work on many challenges relating to water, energy, food, shelter, access to education, and much, much more. To give an idea of the scale of these challenges, around 700 million people live in extreme poverty. These are people that live on less than $1.90 per day. This number is forecast to be reduced down to 600 million by 2030, an improvement and overall trend, but there's still much, much to do. COVID has highlighted the inequalities in the world in which we live, and the 600 million by 2030 is revised, including the disruption that COVID has had to decreasing poverty worldwide. Around 700 million people do not have access to safe drinking water, and a similar amount, around 700 million people, do not have access to electricity. 2 billion people do not have access to sanitation services, and around 3 billion people do not have access to clean fuels for cooking, which has large impacts on indoor air quality and impacts to human health and livelihood potential. Importantly, we understand humanitarian challenges are not being solely engineering problems. And they are strongly interdisciplinary, and this strong interdisciplinary expertise is essential to effective humanitarian engineering solutions. And you will see that in the breadth of expertise we have in our panel here tonight. Humanitarian engineering is the development of appropriate and sustainable solutions for disadvantaged people and communities in Australia and overseas. This is done in partnership with communities, and ideally, it is community-led. Appropriate solutions are those that fit local needs and expectations while making sure to be affordable, maintainable, fixable, without ongoing outside assistance. Sustainable solutions are those that do not create undue pressures on the environment or the people, and importantly, the solution does not simply shift the problem elsewhere. For example, in providing access to clean water, this does not then create an energy problem. Lastly, the humanitarian engineer works in two main settings. There's the acute humanitarian needs in emergencies and chronic emergency situations. This could be in response to a tsunami, or an earthquake, or displacement due to armed conflict. The second one is the chronic humanitarian need, or the ongoing need of poverty. This is largely aligned with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and moving people out of poverty by providing them the things that they need. It is now my pleasure to hand over to Stephen Foster, Dean of UNSW Engineering, to place the role of UNSW in this humanitarian context. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Andrew, and it's great to be back to some face-to-face events after 2 years of indeed challenges. And Andrew put into great context some of the stuff on the world stage, some of the need, and I think I come to reflect on this as an engineer at evenings like this, and I want to reflect not just what we're doing on the world stage, but also what we're doing at home in our own backyard. And I was thinking recently about this and noted that in 2005, the Aboriginal and Torres Straits Islander Justice Commissioner, Professor Tom Calma, AO, in his social justice report, urged the Australian governments to commit to achieving equality for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within 25 years. And in 2007, late 2007, December, COAG, leadership of the then Rudd government, pledged to close the gap in mortality rates and child health. In fact, halve that gap in reading, writing and numeracy within a decade. That decade's gone, and I just asked the question rhetorically, how do you think we have gone in that time? First Closing the Gap report was tabled to Australian Parliament in 2009, and there's been a report every year since. So I dug out one of the most recent ones and had a look at just some of the numbers. In 2018, Indigenous child mortality was twice that of non-Indigenous children. And while there had been some progress, about 7% per annum improvement, in fact, the improvement in the non-Indigenous population was at a faster rate. So the gap actually increased. Similarly, in improvements in life expectancy, while there's been some improvement in men and women of Indigenous backgrounds, that has only been in line with the general improvements of the general population. And the question then comes, what we can do. What's the role of engineers in this? And I was thinking about this before, and the answer is that we can. We are trained. We have the background, we have the capability and the capacity to make life better, not just around the world, but in our backyard too. The work that Dansie's leading in Gulu in Uganda, in the Pacific in Asia, and of course indeed elsewhere in some of these things that we'll talk about tonight. And in 2020, 2021, we as engineering here at UNSW introduced a minor in Humanitarian Engineering, and we've been doing work in different schools building up to that for quite some time. But it was quite a level that now our students who want to engage in this space can do so and have it recognised on their testimony. And to me, that has been a great achievement. Well, let's say it's an advancement. And we look now to the post-COVID education world, and education has changed in 2 years, incredibly so. We had moved in the spirit of 2 weeks to fully online education. The way that we deliver content has changed. So what's the opportunities for us in this space? So where content may be delivered in a different way, we can also deliver that experiential learning better. We can actually have more involvement on campus, more small projects, through things like our vertically integrated projects and the like. We can engage more, and that's a challenge for us to how we do this, but also with our partners in industry, our students, and how we realise these new opportunities that are open to us. And we engage with our most valuable resources. That's our students and our alumni. And we're coming upstairs, and I met, I think it's Ian Bruce, Ian. And Ian had a phrase, and I said, I'm going to steal this phrase. Engineers don't give up. So With that, Andrew and our guests, I'm very, very keen to hear your thoughts tonight and hear on what more we can do and take up the ideas, because for me it's also a moral obligation, because we can. Come on.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'd now like to invite the panel members to come up and take their seats. I'll now ask you to give your self-introductions. First off, I'm very happy to welcome Justine Nolan, Director of the Australian Human Rights Institute.
Thanks, Dansie. Thank you for having us all this evening. I direct the Human Rights Institute here at UNSW, and I'm a professor in the Faculty of Law and Justice. The Human Rights Institute has more than 100 academics across every faculty in the university, including engineering, and we've come together to find basically, research-led practical solutions to real-life human rights problems. My own background is I work very closely in the connection of human rights with business, so what companies' responsibilities are for human rights. And a lot of my work in recent years is focused on modern slavery and in global supply chains. Before I was at UNSW, I was an international human rights lawyer working overseas in the field and also as a corporate lawyer.
Thank you, Justine. And Amit Singh, who's joining us from Fiji, from the Secretariat of the Pacific Community.
Thank you, Dr. Dansie. I'm really happy to be here, part of this panel. So I'm Amit Singh from Fiji. I have a background in environmental science in my degree, and then a master's in water resource management from IHE Delft. I've been working for SPC since 2011, and then I had worked also for the government of Fiji and also for Water Authority of Fiji. So I have this experience in water, both in groundwater and surface water, groundwater in the region. So I've worked in groundwater characterization, assessment and monitoring in Kiribati, Tuvalu, Tonga. I have worked as part of tropical cyclone Ian assessment in Tonga, where we had deployed to look at the infrastructure damage, to the water infrastructure damage after the TCEN. And apart from that, right now I'm working for the NDC Hub as climate change project development specialist, assisting the Pacific Island countries, the 26 Pacific Island countries in advancing their Paris Agreement targets.
Thank you, Amit. And Sanmugi Sivakumar, who's one of our undergraduate students doing some exciting things.
Thanks, Dansie. Hi, everyone. My name is Sanmugi, and I'm currently in my 30s. I'm studying civil and environmental engineering and aspiring to complete a minor in humanitarian engineering as well. I don't have as much of a fancy introduction as everyone here, but I am leading UNSW's drought resistance in Uganda team, which is a social impact project of the Challenge program. I'm also working part-time as an undergraduate design engineer at CPB Contractors. I'm currently working on M6 Stage 1 tunneling project. I guess in terms of my involvement and how I came into humanitarian engineering, which is quite recent, I always knew that I was passionate about helping people, and I knew that my career was going to be focused on helping people somehow, but definitely not health, because I can't do medical procedures and blood, and that doesn't work with me. Yeah, I think my parents are from Sri Lanka, and when I visited my motherland, I saw a lot of poor infrastructure, lack of access to education, resources, and those kinds of things just triggered the interest in me for doing something related to improving the quality of life of individuals, and that's kind of how I got into humanitarian engineering. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you. And Elizabeth Taylor, former chair of Red Hour Australia.
That's probably the introduction. I've had one of those careers all over the place, but for this setting, for 20 years I was involved with Red Hour Australia on the governance of that. I was on the board for 10 years and then chaired it for 10 years, and I think the insights that perhaps I gained over that development, we started with one staff member, and it's now 32 and a very strong international presence, and the way we do business is totally different to the way it was when we started. So I look forward.
Thank you very much. And can I please have a round of applause for our panellists joining us here tonight? Thank you. And so the format for tonight's event is a panel session, very much a discourse between the panellists and the audience as well. Some of you have pre-submitted questions as part of registration, so I'm going to read some of them out. And then about halfway through, we're going to transfer to the Slido here. So you can add your questions onto Slido. And as they'll come through, they'll get sent through to me, and we can ask them to the panel as well. So yeah, please do write down your questions. I think the information will be coming shortly about how to do that. And we'll start off with some of the pre-submitted questions. The first question is the only question I'm going to ask all of you to answer, just to the interests of time. And we'll go in the order that we just went through, I think, for introductions. What do you see as the major humanitarian challenge we face in 2022?
Well, for me, the major humanitarian challenge is also the most significant challenge to human rights that we face, which is climate. Dealing with the climate crisis, understanding, galvanising action, and having action that is not siloed between different sectors of industry, government and community. That we need to see climate as this all-encompassing issue that affects humanitarian issues, it affects how infrastructure, that it is the biggest challenge that we face in human rights. And if I was allowed to put a sort of a sub part to the climate, then I would say, given what we've been through in the last 2 years, the other major challenge is basically getting shots in arms, that a large majority of the world remains unvaccinated. And largely in countries, the vaccination rate has been inequitable where it has happened. And so that remains, in Australia and other countries, we've seemed like we're moving on. But much of the world still needs to be vaccinated if we're going to avoid what happened in 2020 and 2021 again.
Thank you. Amit?
Thank you. So one of the major challenges, humanitarian challenges I see in 2022 is the inability of millions of people living in developing world to adjust to the impacts of climate change-induced environmental change within their vicinity or where they are living. And these changes are more pronounced in the region where I come from. We are living in an age where we have reached Mars. We have aspirations to reach other planets, but there are millions of people there who are fighting or are at the forefront of adapting to these changes that are caused by a changing climate, whether it's floods, whether it's tropical cyclones, its intensities. And the inability of most of us to recognize their resilience, which they have put in so many decades. They have been living there. I think it's time now that we could learn something from their resilience, how they have managed to survive all this long in these locations, and I think the time is right now that we go back and see what they have done right, integrate that with the studies or the designs we are doing, and then come map our way forward in improving their livelihoods.
Thank you.
Yeah, honestly, I was going to say climate change as well. You guys have already said it, so I'll probably focus on something else. I think another big humanitarian challenge that we're facing right now, and I think especially impoverished and disadvantaged communities, is achieving food sovereignty. I think the access to food, especially in countries such as India, Africa, just the nations which have a lot of resources, but they're split unequally between individuals. If you see these developing nations, there is a wide inequality. There's a big range in between the rich and the poor, and there's just so many inequalities that marginalized communities such as farmers and other people face. And I think in terms of achieving food sovereignty, it's more about bringing out humanitarian solutions to include those communities in terms of participation, including them in terms of policy making and things like that, and also empowering them to be able to achieve the food sovereignty of being able to originate, produce, and consume their own food. And I think that's quite important in terms of enabling them to get their individual autonomy and things like this. And that's quite closely tied with climate change, which is affecting food sovereignty and farmers right now. And there's a big case going on farmer suicide, especially India and other countries like that. And I think that's an issue that we need to raise and focus solutions on. So yeah.
Is that on? Yes. I absolutely agree with everything that's just been said, and I was going to perhaps put a different lens on it, that from my perspective, I think what I've seen over the last couple of years is fear changing our whole perception of how we can engage with everything. There's been a retreat from empathy. There's been a signalling that even those that we are working together with are not comfortable with the structures that we have had in place in the past to support and work with people. And it's going to take a different mindset to have any effective activities supporting those responses that we have to the challenges that we are facing.
Thank you very much. And one of the other pre-submitted questions I think sort of follows on from what you were talking about, Sanmugi, so I might throw this one to you, and then I think, Justine, you might want to also potentially add to that, was to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, it appears that developed countries need to willingly reduce their aspirations and redistribute wealth to those nations struggling. Can these goals be achieved without this?
Thanks for just chucking that
That's a big
hard question at me. I think, well, other than financial aid, the one thing that sticks out at me is us as developed nations being able to help developing nations with programs such as educational initiatives. I think education is really, really important in being able to influence society, and especially in communities where there's individuals who don't have the access to education and are from poor socioeconomic backgrounds. I think being able to educate them will allow them to make more well-informed decisions about their life, which will ultimately reduce or work towards reducing inequalities. Other than that, another crazy solution that comes into my mind, I don't know how possible this is, but I think if us as, just for example, if we take Australia, and there's country B, which is a developing nation, if we're able to influence the policy making of country B, which is a developing nation, through foreign exchange and foreign trades. For example, if let's say that we're exporting a commodity to country B, which they really desperately need. If we say something like, if country B implements these policies to help the uneducated or these marginalized communities to include them and empower them and put initiatives which will help them, we can reduce the amount of the price that you need to pay for those commodities. Things like that. I don't know if that makes sense, but just being able to try and influence their policy making through some kind of foreign exchange and trade and those kinds of things. But I think that education tip is probably more practical.
Yeah, I think that where the so-called developed countries or high-income countries, a lot of here got through made their wealth through the colonial past, and how do we redistribute that is a very big question. So thank you for taking that off the bat. Justine, is there anything you'd like to add or your perspective, please?
Sure. I mean, the SDGs are, a bit of a touchy point with me. I mean, they've become a major sort of consulting conference agenda, but not necessarily accompanied by practical action. So there's millions of dollars that are spent with people talking about the SDGs from government, from business, from civil society. But it's both developed and developing countries where the SDGs aren't being met. Issues like the right to food, the right to water, the right to housing are rights that are not met in Australia, let alone in other countries as well. So Australia is not, when we look at who should be, should we be thinking about it, we also need to be looking in our own backyard, as Stephen mentioned at the start. So the SDGs, I think the change that needs to happen is that they shouldn't be considered aspirational, but they should be considered as fulfilling fundamental rights. It's the responsibility of government, but it's also the responsibility of business to do it. You know, we've got a crazy man spending $44 billion to buy a company, and we think about what that could do. What could that money achieve? About $6.5 billion would wipe out hunger. Yet that's not seen as a necessity. So we need to alter the way that we think about fundamental rights, what can be achieved and who's responsible for them. It's us, but it's also who has the most leverage at the moment is business and government. Australia has been incrementally reducing their aid budget for decades. And then the Solomon Islands happens and we all look surprised, about things like that. So there's a big complete picture, but in some ways something with like the SDGs is that everybody's responsible, so no one's responsible. So we lose responsibility and we lose accountability. But I think if we change our mindset about being a necessity rather than aspirational, then we would start to get there.
Okay. Thank you both for those answers. The next one, I think Amit and then maybe Elizabeth might have some insights to share here, was what is the key to positively impacting impoverished communities while maintaining cultural sensitivity and navigating the societal differences between your lived experience and theirs? Another softball.
Okay, so I'll start with that. So I think one of the key to that is, as we go in, we have our own biases. We need to get rid of that first, and to make a difference, I think it's very important we get rid of the bias and the stereotype we have had about cultures whilst we were growing up, and then go in working with the community. I think the key to working with the communities is the friendship you provide to them. I think you need to be comfortable. You need to make them comfortable in the way you approach them. Plus, especially if you're working in the Pacific, we have this notion of talanoa, where you go in with the mindset of discussing without any, let's say, preconceived outcomes, predetermined outcomes. So go in with the open mind of discussing of the issue, and then eventually, whilst the discussion is going on, you will get whatever you want. And as soon as you start discussing with an open mind, I'm sure opportunities pop up where you can collaborate further and really understand the context in which they are living, plus the problems they are facing, and then try and work together and determine our way forward.
Thank you.
I'd like to fully support that, and I love that phrase, walking together with, because that, I'd say, is one of the biggest shifts that we made in Red R over the 20 years, is I think that there was a certain mindset 20, 25 years ago that the heroes were going to rush into places and save everybody in a situation. The way the approach is now is to walk with, to approach a situation with a humble understanding that for that context you may have some very critical skills that are going to support that community, but you don't know probably 90% of what's required, and ensuring that you have the courage to enable them to own the solution is the most appropriate way forward. Some of the best work that we have done recently has been in the Pacific with the national disaster management offices of each of the, in a number of the islands, and the work with them has been transformational in resilience building in those communities, because it's done by the communities the way those communities feel is appropriate for them, with the support and insights that, say, engineers or whoever of our other deployees are participating in that. But it's certainly not the attitude that I remember 25 years ago of the Great White Saviour, which is probably not the way forward.
Thank you both very much. We'll move over to the live audience questions now, so please keep them coming through. But But this one here follows on very much from what I've been talking about, the cultural and the social side of things. The question is, engineers generally have strong technical skills. How do we ensure that they have these social, ethical and cultural skills needed to successfully engage in humanitarian engineering? Amit?
I'll take that. I think it's quite an interesting question, and I was just wondering about it. So you see, whilst you're doing engineering, it could be very prescriptive, yeah. But then you have a stream of social scientists also, and quite often what happens is, for example, if there's an issue, you may have social scientists looking at it, and also engineers look at it in a very prescriptive manner, whereas social scientists, they look at it along social side of stuff. Most probably, what is the motivation, what is the interest? These are the questions they ask. What is the interest of this group? Why are they doing this? What is their motivation? What are the actors working? Who are the coalition? Why are they supporting these kind of ideas? So what happens is that you have very, let's say, discipline-specific solutions for this. I think the way forward here is for engineers and social scientists to work together, integrate and learn, collaborate and learn from each other as to how they could put forward solutions that would help the communities or people who need this assistance. Because, for example, if you go in with a very preset engineering solution to a people, let's say, affected by coastal inundation, and then you take a contractor to implement that project, it's done and it's done. The communities don't have a buy-in apart from a grey wall that is in front of their village. But if you go in and consult the communities and ask them, we are trying to put this structure up. Would you prefer a grey infrastructure or a grey-green or a green infrastructure? And the way you design a grey-green infrastructure, let's say a hybrid seawall, where you get materials from the community, you get women group to plant mangroves, you get youth group or girls group to plant vegetation. The involvement is very different. You are trying to address the problem, but the way it is being addressed is sustainable and with community at the heart of it, and it's very sustainable in terms of the infrastructure itself. So I think that could be one of the ways you can do that.
Thank you very much.
I wouldn't mind just adding to that from an education point of view, because I'm an ex-academic, so I have to say something about that when you say embed those attributes into engineering, it really has to start at the beginning. It has to be role modelled by the staff. It has to be role modelled by the way the curriculum is designed. I remember many years ago when I was an academic, at one stage we decided that communications should be structured rather than just the engineers teaching the other young engineers how to do communication. We would actually draw on the communications faculty to give the expertise and sort of the academic rigour, and then an example would be done and they would co-teach together. What was fascinating about that is the behaviour of the students, because they had already had 3 years of being told that engineers know everything and nobody else knows anything, and so their behaviour was appalling. The women students painted their nails and chatted. The males drew a whole lot of obscene things all over the handouts while the non-engineer was speaking, and they behaved impeccably when the engineer spoke. So for me, it was about how much the curriculum and the role modelling and expectations of other engineers were defining their sense of how they should respond. A couple of years later, some of them came back and said how embarrassed they were about their responses when they realised the real world actually didn't expect that either. So it's one of those stories that is about the power of the curriculum, of what you say is important and how you role model respect outside of the profession. That's going to be what makes it valuable in terms of embedding all of those other expectations. Not they have to know everything, but they have to know how to respect those people who know how to get that information for them.
Thank you very much. I think you've touched on a key thing there, is that our role as universities, as a university and the tertiary sector in general, in both research and education. There's a question here I'd like to now ask on that. So what do you think is the best way to bring awareness to everyone outside the university or non-researchers for our research outputs to show the importance of the current global struggles? How do we effectively communicate our research findings to non-researchers in the humanitarian space?
None of us want that one.
That's right. We can move on.
Well, I could give it a go. Like someone's taken the time to answer the question. I mean, some of that, like when I look at it through the lens of the Human Rights Institute, builds on what Elizabeth was saying, is that what you're trying to do is often have a research-led approach to a really practical problem. So a lot of the time that means not talking in research language when you're talking outside that field. You're trying to relate the problem to the issues that the people face. And so I think it's using your approach and research, and then taking a really practical approach when you're doing it. And you're looking at what impact does the work have, what does it mean to policymakers, what does it mean to people in the community, and translating your research to real world issues, then bring people on board with you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And another question that we have here follows on with something you just said, and I think we might have some expertise on the panel about this. What are the challenges of engaging policymakers in order to provide the most appropriate responses to humanitarian crisis or needs?
So the question again?
What are the challenges of engaging policymakers in order to provide the most appropriate response to humanitarian crisis or needs?
Okay, I think one of the major challenges to engage with policymakers is the fact that you need to do away with bureaucracy. Most of the time, it might be draining you of your energy and your enthusiasm, but it's something that needs to be done and is important. I think to share my experience in the way we have operated or have worked in the region. I was deployed in one of the countries post tropical cyclone and going in the country, working with a lot of partners who were working in the humanitarian field with a lot of international agencies. So there was a lot of information coming up about the situation on the ground, which was not necessarily true. A lot of this was feeding to the policymakers, let's say the government officials who were there on the ground, and they were making decisions which is very erratic at that moment in time. Also considering the fact that what would the repercussions be if they make announcement which is not suitable, to the political ideology or the political motivations given that time. So we had to advise them on issues that were very, let's say, heart of the situation, give them a practical, let's say, priority kind of stuff, where the focus should be, after a disaster. It's first on ensuring that the water is safe to drink, ensuring that there is no waterborne disease after the disaster, ensuring that the medical facility has got is safe to operate and has got equipment and people to look after if there is any break. So so you have to navigate your way through what is going on during that moment in time, especially considering what would be the political repercussions if decisions are made based on political ideologies and how they go about trying to make most of the time, most of it doing disasters and make political mileage out of it. Yes.
Thank you very much, Amit. And the next one, I think, Justine, comes from something that you had mentioned, is that projects good, and it very much talks to actually the empowerment of this title of this lecture series as well. Projects good for society seem at odds with the profit-driven aims of private industry. How can we get involved with humanitarian engineering projects and still earn an income?
Well, I think that the biggest challenge around humanitarian engineering is to not have it operate as a niche form of engineering, because engineering itself should be sustainable and long-term and involve community in solutions. And that fits within the mold of humanitarian engineering, but really that to me should be engineering. So we need to think about how business, I mean, the bigger question, of course, is like, how do we change business models? How do we, think about that? But being sustainable and building long-term projects actually is profitable. Protecting human rights in short-term business projects costs money. So we shouldn't assume that there's no upfront costs, but having sustainable projects, having less turnover of staff, having more skilled staff, having longer-term projects on the ground, in many sectors is showing that it is profitable for many companies, rather than being, a short-term sort of reactive solution. So part of it, though, is also thinking about changing our business models, how we split profits, particularly, say, in a supply chain or in a project, that, the company at the apex sometimes will have to give up a bigger slice of the pie for companies within the project. That is changing how we think about business in some ways, and that it has a broader societal good. I think the way people think about business now is not the way people thought about business in the 70s or on the 80s. That business has a social purpose, that there is a greater good, but that can exist alongside, and it needs to exist alongside profit, because business is fueling the ability to do this. So you can't have purpose and profit being siloed. They need to coexist.
And I think that very much speaks to the Empowering Lives tag that we had for this event, is that it's something about it's giving people their ability to perhaps increase their income or have access to clean water or sanitation or other things that will benefit their lives and allow them to achieve a higher potential. I think there's some World Bank data. Every $1 spent in sanitation for those 2 billion people around the world that don't have access to a toilet, every $1 invested returns about $5 to $7 back for people having better health, less reliance on healthcare, being able to work more, and those kind of things there. So private sector, also government investment in facilities, how that profit is calculated is something that is very open, and the empowerment of the people that we're helping think is something that's key about humanitarian engineering is it's working with the people to build that capacity and give them that strength and give them that ability.
And the same is opposite of investing in women. So the more that you invest in women in communities, then that tends to bring a greater return as well.
I just want to add something to this. Just a question to the audience, maybe, and we had this discussion during lunch. I think it's very important also to look at the fact that, as project managers, we normally look at, there's a tough battle for project efficiency and empowerment, when you're implementing a project. So though your project would be focused on, let's say, empowering women on certain issues, but then because it is a project, it is time bound, 3 years or 4 years, whatever it is. If you really go for empowerment, you lose on project efficiency. If you go for efficiency, you lose the empowerment component of it. So it's a very thin line between empowering and being efficient, and that's something we need to consider while we are designing projects, or in that case, designing infrastructure also. So I think that's something we should think about most of the time whilst we are doing development work, and I think it's very critical. Only if you are able to strike that balance, you will get the intended outcomes of the activity you're undertaking.
Could I pick that one up as well, in terms of perhaps it's time that we reconceptualise what we mean by business, because we're all in business. And so it's each of our individual decisions and how we either vote as shareholders, or we participate, or we make those day-to-day decisions that either make us humanitarian or not. So it's not as though it's a them and us situation. It's far more complicated than that, and that builds on what we've just heard as well. So I think I found that very much in in Red R at the beginning, as though a number of the deployees were saying, oh, we can't possibly take money from industry because then we're bad. And so it meant that a whole lot of positive reinforcement of behaviours, or companies that did want to do different things beyond the profit motive were then being denied the right to be trying to do the right thing, and it started to be reserved for a particular group of people that felt that they were better than other people. And so that question worries me in that sense, because it's not necessarily reflective of the reality. That's not to say that there aren't people out there, but the bigger question, perhaps going back to what the biggest problems we have are, for example, waste, and yet we all laud people who are sending up space junk, and nobody's going to make them pay for it. So we have not changed our models at all in terms of how we are not, as engineers, challenging the next generation of pioneers who are junking perhaps the last place on Earth or near Earth that we haven't junked already.
Thank you all. That's some very, very thoughtful answers there. And I hadn't thought about that. Yes, we haven't changed our approach, and now we're just junking the space as we explore it. The most liked question here, I think maybe Elizabeth and Sanmugi might have some insights here, is what actions should someone interested in humanitarian engineering take?
I think
career advice, I believe. This is career
Don't
advice.
go to space.
Yeah.
I think it's just don't assume that you don't have opportunities throughout your career to participate. It's not as though you have to signal in a particular situation. There is humanitarian engineering requirements everywhere. One in terms of how engineering should be practiced anyway. But if you just take it then down to disadvantaged groups, it's about being aware of and working out how to engage with them. So when I was an academic in central Queensland, then engagement with the Indigenous peoples, working out how we could work with them to incorporate them into the curriculum. That was humanitarian engineering from what would normally be seen as just a sort of business activity that I was doing. So in your lives, there will be humanitarian engineering possibilities. So work to gain experiences in those, and that's how you gain experience.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think adding on from Elizabeth, I think everyone has a humanitarian side within themselves, and it's just about bringing that out and maybe finding a career in that even. I think in terms of professionals who are already in the field, I won't be able to give as much advice, but I think, aside from your normal jobs, trying to involve in organizations such as Red R or Engineers Without Borders and other World Health Organizations and other organizations. I think trying to involve in that even in a part-time basis or just on the weekends, maybe on a yearly basis in the holidays, I think that's a good opportunity to be able to do something that you want to do, such as your humanitarian desire, and be able to have that fulfillment in life, but also be able to have your work on the same side. For more younger professionals, people studying engineering or whoever may be interested in that humanitarian side and want to study further in uni, I think doing subjects or doing degrees such as civil engineering, environmental engineering, biomedical engineering, they're all directly related to humanitarian engineering. And we also have that newly introduced humanitarian engineering minor, which is also something that you can take on. Other than the degree side, you can also do master's and PhD in something environmental related or humanitarian related, and focus on that humanitarian side in terms of studies. But other than studies, I think also trying to take the most advantage of any opportunity that comes your way. I think that's the most important, most overrated tip, but it's the most important. I think you need to put yourself out there, seek out any opportunities that you might be interested in. I think UNSW offers quite a wide range of projects and initiatives which students can get involved in, such as me being in drought resistance in Uganda. I think the challenge program of UNSW has vertically integrated projects and social impact projects, which has quite a few humanitarian engineering projects which you can get involved in. There's also other programs and initiatives which come throughout the year which you can get some humanitarian experience in. So I think overall, it's just about going out and putting yourself out there and just taking advantage of any opportunity that you see in terms of humanitarian side. So yeah.
Thank you very much. We just have time now for one more question. And I'll open this up to the whole panel. That follows on something that you mentioned earlier, Sanmugi. Sanmugi, you mentioned sovereignty is key. How can we avoid the politics where aid is tied to a nation's intentions in a region? Political sovereignty is critical. Can we separate humanitarian engineering and politics, or should we?
I think, honestly, it is quite closely linked. In terms of food sovereignty, if we take on food sovereignty, achieving food sovereignty is quite a big issue in developing nations. And in those developing nations, a lot of those nations are ruled by partially, I don't want to say fully, but partially colluded governments where there's a lot of political play and power, abuse of power and things like that. And I think the concepts of the powers of politics and humanitarian engineering, they do intertwine, because when you're trying to implement strategies and schemes at trying to empower marginalized communities, in the end, you do need the power of the government and of the support of that nation. And I think it is really important. And I think, honestly, I need to do a bit of research on that too. So I think we need to definitely figure out some strategies on how to be able to influence the government as well, because I think that is definitely very important when trying to implement humanitarian strategies, especially in other nations. Yeah.
Thank you. Any of the other panel members?
Oh, politics is part of being human, so it's very much part of humanity and humanitarian engineering. Mm-hmm. So the one story is when we were setting up refugee camps in the Sudan, to get the food across, you had to negotiate how much you were going to give to each of the overlords on the way through. Mm. So whatever situation you find yourself in, it's likely to have politics, and to pretend that's not going to be how you have to construct the response means there won't be an appropriate response.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those questions. We've run out of time for any more panel discussion. Some of the things I did pick up during the discussion, some of the common themes or some of the things that I mentioned that really do speak to both the challenges of the humanitarian engineering approach, but also its strength in its multidisciplinarity and working not only in our engineering faculty, but broader, both with interfaculty at the university and also with our external partners as well, which is why having such a range of panel members was so important to this event. So thank you very much. But the climate was something that came through, and that was tied to things such as food sovereignty and ownership of what is produced within your nation's borders. We live in a very globalized world now, and COVID has shone the light on that in many, many ways. The participation and the engagement of the community, the going in with open ears, Amit, that you mentioned as well. Going in and listening, that is sometimes and often a luxury. When you have project funding, you go in to deliver a solution rather than going in to develop it from the ground up. So trying to take that first step is something I think we really need to build in to our funders and perhaps our international aid funding or our domestic funding as well. Going in with open ears and not coming in with just a solution and saying this will solve the problem. I think that's one of the key challenges for the humanitarian engineer going forward. Education was touched on too in different ways there. I think UNSW and the universities in Australia that are now offering minors or majors and other things in humanitarian engineering play a key role in giving the tools needed to engineers to be able to go and communicate, to be able to go work in perhaps resource-scarce environments, or be able to go and work with lawyers or public health officials and other interactions like that. And I think that's something that's really exciting to be able to offer. I'm really honoured to be able to work with students that come towards the end of their degree in their third year. They normally get to me for the fundamentals course, and just see the passion and the hope in their eyes, and being able to give them some of those tools to set them off into the world to do that is something that I find really, really rewarding. So I'd like to please have a round of applause again to thank our panellists for tonight. I would also like to please thank the team that put this together, Melody, Veju, Sarah and Bron. This is their first face-to-face live event in over 2 years, so thank you very much for that. And we'd very much like to continue socialising at a safe distance, and there's some drinks and canapes downstairs for the next hour, so please do join us down there and come and speak to the speakers and other people. And thank you very much again for coming. It's been our pleasure.